Thank you so much for coming this evening. I'm very lucky to have with me a very distinguished and exciting panel to sort of work through an immensely complex subject, which I hope we're going to actually embrace in its complexity. And there'll be, we'll talk for about an hour, and then I think at least half an hour to talk with the audience. I don't know, I was just thinking as this was starting, I guess I qualify as a Ukrainian Jew. I was born in Kiev, I'm Jewish. But growing up, I would never have thought of myself, growing up in London, as a Ukrainian Jew. There was no Ukrainian Jewish community. There was no identity or even a story around this idea that I could associate myself with. When the Maidan started, the revolution in Ukraine in 2014, I had my relatives who also were born in Ukraine and Jewish, but now lived in the US, all calling me saying, "This is terrible. Fascists have taken over Ukraine." I was like, "What are you talking about?" And they're like, we remember our families, the pogroms. We remember how terrible it was for Jews in Ukraine." And I was like, I think you may be getting some sort of poorly informed background on this. But this is an incredibly complicated and kind of dynamic area to look at. And it's one that's being created. What is the Ukrainian Jewish encounter? What does it mean to be a Ukrainian Jew? And that's what we'll be thinking about today in various aspects. We'll dip into history, we'll look at the present, we'll think about the future. So the panel today is going from right to left. Mark Freiman is a board member of the UJE, who are one of the co-organizers of this event. To my left is Professor Yaroslav Hrytsak of the Ukrainian Catholic University, also taught at Harvard and Columbia. And on my far left is Iosif Zissels. He's currently the director of Vaad, which is a civil society organization that brings together Jewish organizations and communities in Ukraine. But Iosif is also kind of a very important figure in Ukrainian history. He's a very, very famous dissident and spent 10, 12 years in political... 6 years in political camps in the Soviet Union, and we'll be dipping into that as well. I think we'll start with history, though. We'll take a step back to try to somehow contextualize this very rich and difficult subject of Ukraine and Jews. So Yaroslav, you're the historian, so I'm going to start with you. Can you, how can we talk at all about the idea of Ukrainian Jews, of how Jewish self-identification in Ukraine? And you can start as early as you like. I don't know, start with the medieval period, or give us a little bit of context on this subject.
Probably the best way to start is somewhere in the late medieval, early modern times, but not to complicate things too much. Think about Ukraine, 16th, 17th century, or one of the territories which has the largest number of Jews in the world. Say that Jews in the Kyiv or probably in Lviv, these two largest cities in Ukraine, had much more Jews than, say, in 19th century, than, say, in New York or Moscow or Petersburg or even Vienna. Because basically the majority of Jews were living in this territory. It was called Yiddish land, former Polish territory, and some large chunk was living in Ukraine. So there was, to put the long story short, there were many Jews in Ukraine, probably too many Jews in Ukraine, but there were no Ukrainian Jews. So this provides you with some kind of the introduction with this research. So basically, Ukrainian Jews as a kind of identity, as a kind of group, is a very recent phenomenon. We may dispute when it started, basically, but say, at least in the 19th century, since I'm in the 19th century, you could tell it confidently, there were some Jews who were speaking Ukrainian, there were some Jews who were marrying to Ukrainians, there were some Jews who were solidarizing with Ukrainian cause, but there were no Ukrainian Jews. And this is kind of general tendency, especially in this region between Berlin and Moscow, with the territory with very extremely mixed population, ethnically, religiously, whatever you think about any terms. So basically the story is that you have many two groups, and each of the minority groups tended to say, to support the ruling elites, which was very rational. So Jews was not exception in this case. So say you will have many Jews in Slovakia, but you don't have any Slovak Jews. You have many Jews in Transylvania, Romanian Transylvania, but probably mostly Hungarian Jews, never Romanian Jews, and so on and so forth. So this is basically the story. So when was the turning point started? Basically on the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And most importantly, and probably surprisingly, it comes with the emergence of Zionism, with the two nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism and New Zionism, which is kind of another version of the nationalism of that region. And quite of a sudden, they find a common language. And the common language was because they had a common enemy. In the Russian Empire was the Russian Empire, imperial rule. In the Polish territory was a Polish rule, basically was still Hungarian Empire, with Austro-Hungarian Empire, but basically for a variety of reasons which we wouldn't explain, it was basically Polish rule. And for some reasons, for sure, Ukrainians are known for their anti-Semitism, and this is a long story to tell, but we should also take into account the Ukrainian anti-Semitism was no exception. It was, I'm sorry to tell, it was rather a rule. In a sense, the Polish anti-Semitism was much stronger than Ukrainian anti-Semitism, and so therefore it was quite natural for Jews, especially Zionists, to look for alliance, and this natural alliance was Ukrainians who were actually also against the Poles or against the Russian Empire in this period. So to tell the long story short, just probably kind of paradoxical thing that you probably know that Jews were not recognized as a nation, logistically. They were either a religious group or an ethnic group, but never as a nation, because nation presumes some kind of political rights and cultural rights. So the first national group who demanded that Jews supposed to be recognized as a nation was Ukrainians. And they did in Austrian parliament. And there is a clear statement, 1908, when there is a Ukrainian deputy, member of the Austrian the parliament, demanded that Jews were supposed to be recognized officially as a separate nation, with all the implied rights, all the kind of things. So basically, I'm saying there was a long tradition of the Jewish-Ukrainian dialogue, reconciliation, rapport, whatever you mean by that, and this is one part of the story. The other part of the story that, for sure, because Jews were living in this territory, there was a small minority, there was one middleman. Most of Ukrainians were living in the villages. Jews were more educated, living in the urban milieu, the kind of things. So what I'm saying here, you have a lot of ground for the animosities, social, ethnic, religious. If you look in the Ukrainian proverbs of the time or sayings, you clearly could see that Jews, in the popular understanding consciousness, is the absolute other. That there's nothing that local peasant could and define themselves with the Jews. And since peasants made the majority population, 90% population, so to say, you could easily imagine the size, the scale of the anti-Semitism. So on one side, you have a kind of very positive message, record of Ukrainian-Jewish relations, basically when the leaders telling to each other, elitist leaders. And on the other hand, you have a society, mostly Ukrainian society, which is not just ready for this kind of dialogue, but just kind of perception. And therefore, Ukraine is known, for a variety of the reasons, as a territory of the stable anti-Semitism. So therefore, it's very hard to tell the one story of the Ukrainian-Jewish relations, always several stories, and always the story of what was prevail. So probably to put the story short, to end some story short. So on the one hand, we have this kind of history of Ukrainian-Jewish relation, with old tradition, even so come very close to the Jews and defined with Ukrainian cause, but not becoming Ukrainian Jews. On the other hand, we have a long record of the anti-Jewish violence, anti-Semitism, starting with Khmelnytsky, ending with the Second World War, and this is very painful, long record. So idea is what to do with those two, how to find a balance between these two stories. So I believe that crucial point came after the Second World War, because after the Second World War, this distinction between Ukrainian and Jews started to disappear. First of all, Ukrainians ceased to be a peasant nation. They become a very much urban, educated nation, all kind of things, so the social distinction disappeared. On the other hand, both Ukrainians and especially Jews became more secularized, so therefore the religious difference also didn't play that much role. And also because they found themselves in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of this dialogue between Ukrainian and Jewish dissidents. So there's many chances for this reconciliation. But the turning point was the establishment of the Ukrainian state. Because since Ukraine became independent, this tendency started to work. Because Jews are supposed to solidarize, to sympathize, to find support for the ruling elite. And since ruling elite becomes Ukrainian, by definition, there was a chance for emergence of Ukrainian Jews. But this is not an automatic process. There's just possibility. This possibility was realized only with the Second Maidan, I believe. I believe the Second Maidan was really turning the point. And I wouldn't go the story because I would save the story for the Iosif to tell it, but I believe still what is the Second World War is a turning point, and I believe Peter was modest enough because I do remember his article in London Book Review Books, which has a very interesting title, I'm Ukrainian. And this is believed that something tells that many Jews at that time, in Ukraine specifically, discovered their Ukrainian identity, because quite of a sudden this Ukrainian identity was quite different than the previous historical record of this anti-Semitism, or this kind of the violence, or the kind of thing, because quite of a sudden Ukrainian cause appeared very much attractive, very much liberal, very much pro-European, with European values and things like that. And this created this kind of breeding ground for the emergence of the Ukrainian identity among the Jews. And we're still discussing where Ukrainian Maidan, the second Maidan, makes a turning point, or point of no return, in many senses. Unfortunately, we couldn't say these economical reforms get too far, or political reforms are very successful. So we're still discussing, we have the turning point in this kind of political economical reforms. But what I believe, the turning point in the Jewish Ukrainian identity has been already transpassed. So there's no coming back. For the first time, we have this Ukrainian Jewish identity, and this is something we have to cherish, specifically Ukrainians.
I'm just thinking what language I should ask Osip questions in. Вы будете говорить по-русски или по-украински? Как вам удобно?
Далее про идентичность.
Окей, хорошо. Тогда я буду по-русски, чтобы был третий язык. But I don't want to send the translator mad, so hold on, I'll stick to English. Osip, I have to pick up on a point, though, that Yaroslav raised here. When you were in the Soviet political prisoner camps, which mixed, obviously, political prisoners and criminals, were there ethnic subgroups? Were there like Jewish prisoners and Ukrainian prisoners and Russian ones, or did you all just become one group of political prisoners?
Ну, я все ж таки, по-перше, хочу сказати добрий вечір, good evening. Потім подякувати організаторам за можливість цієї дискусії, а також подякувати за запрошення. Мені дуже приємно приймати участь в ній. Я ж, пан Ярослав майже не залишив мені можливості щось вставити в історичний аспект. І я тому не буду на цьому багато зупинятися, але скажу, що ідентичність, колективна ідентичність євреїв європейських, вона ніколи не була довго однаковою. Вона змінювалася з часом, вона модернізувалася, як і інші ідентичності колективні. І переломний момент, я додам до того, що перелічив пан Ярослав, це була французька революція, бо саме після французької революції суттєво змінилася ідентичність європейських євреїв. Вони стали відчувати себе громадянами, вони отримали емансипацію в Європі, і виникла така дивна формула – француз Мойсеєва закона або німець Мойсеєва закона. Тобто це був момент утворення громадянських політичних націй, коли всі меншини, які знаходились в тих державах, асоціювали себе, ідентифікували себе з державою. Це державницький був підхід до нації, громадянський. Але оскільки конфесійність, релігійність була різна, то це була ознака відмінності. І це було ідентифікуючий такий маркер. І це продовжувалося досить довго, і наприкінці 19 століття сталося те, що сказав пан Ярослав. Виникла нова ідентичність сіоністська, яка полягала в тому, що євреї вже не хотіли асимілюватися, окультурюватися, а вони хотіли створити свою державу, щоб продовжувати бути там євреями. Було багато чого, але в відношеннях між українцями і євреями на території України таке враження, що багато сторіч був певний рок, тобто негативний аспект дуже сильний. Крім всіх зв'язків, крім спільної праці, культурних зв'язків і таке інше, були страшні події 17 сторіччя, 18 сторіччя, 17 – це воїни Богдана Хмельницького, в 18-му це Коліївщина, в 19-му погроми наприкінці в Російській імперії, потім громадянська війна з її величезними вбивствами євреїв. І було таке враження не дослідника, а пересічних громадян, що всі спроби українців створити свою державу, реалізувати соціальний процес чи національний, пов'язані з дуже великими проблемами, трагічними для євреїв. Це змінилося, але тільки в 91-му році, коли Україна стала незалежною державою. Вперше ми бачимо в історії, що спроба українців створити свою державу не просто вдала, вона вдалася, і цьому повороту також вже немає. І це головний чинник. І те саме сталося з відношенням до меншин, зокрема до євреїв. Бо, як каже і наш друг Мирослав Марінович, відомий дисидент, проректор Українського католичного університету, у українців змінився образ майбутнього, модель майбутнього. В цьому новому майбутньому, на відміну від колоніального життя в Російській імперії, в них не було місця для того, що було антисемітизмом в Російській імперії або у совєтські часи. На жаль, ідентичність євреїв у совєтські часи піддалася дуже сильно асиміляції. Але ми повинні враховувати, що перш ніж приступити до асиміляції потужної, до наступу на релігію, до наступу на етнічні відмінності, совєтська влада або знищила всіх, хто їй опирався, зокрема і євреїв, які були проти совєтської влади, а всіх тих, хто вона не знищила, вона викинула за кордон, в еміграцію. Тому залишилось тільки ті, хто здатні були пристосуватися. І це були і українці, і євреї, і всі інші. Бо це насилля і брехня, якими оперувала совєтська влада, вони примусили пристосуватися до тої ганебної системи соціальної, якою називалася Совєтський Союз. І євреї почали втрачати все, що в них було з ідентичності. Всі релігійні корені, всі історичні, мову, літературу. І так тягнулося до 91-го року. Бо вже в ті роки, що я пам'ятаю, 60-ті, 70-ті, 80-ті, все менше і менше було людей, які володіли мовою ідиш. Про єврит я вже не кажу. Це взагалі були одиниці. Ті, хто знали історію. Я трошки пам'ятаю історію, бо мені батько колись, 50-ті роки, трошки розповідав. Але не було цілеспрямованого виховання, не було цілеспрямованої освіти єврейської ніколи у совєтські роки. І так було до тих пір, поки не створилася ідентичність, в якій було тільки два елементи, які можу позначити. Перше – це державний антисемітизм, який підштовхував євреїв залишатися євреями, бо в них не було куди дітися від того. І по-друге, це тайна симпатія до держави Ізраїль, яка виникла у 48 році. Ось ці два чинники були єдині, що пов'язували євреїв совєтських у цьому союзі. Є навіть така анекдотична історія. Пітер попросив, я не можу не реагувати. Австралійське єврейство в Австралії традиційне, дуже схоже на британське єврейство. Ну, і, звичайно, бо воно корені звідси. Воно останні 30 років дивляться на хвилі еміграції з усього світу в Австралію, єврейської еміграції. І вони виділяють 3 групи євреїв. 2 з них вони не сприймають як євреїв взагалі, а одну кажуть, так, це щось таке, що нам схоже на нас. Хто це? Я не буду тут загадками казати, я зразу скажу. Совєтських євреїв, австралійські євреї не сприймають взагалі як євреїв, бо вони майже нічого не знають своєї історії. Я кажу про совєтські часи до 91-го року. Друге, вони не сприймають як євреїв Ізраїль, бо це нова ідентичність ізраїльська, яка дуже відрізняється від ідентичності британських євреїв, від ідентичності американських євреїв. Є навіть соціологічне дослідження в 90-ті роки Лібмана і Коена, яке показує, що це 2 різних ідентичності, 2 різних народи, хоч і ті вважають себе євреями. І нарешті третє – це євреї Південної Африки, які попадали в Австралію. Їх вони вважають. Таким чином, Вчені сьогодні бачать в світі 3 типи ідентичності єврейської. Це західноєвропейська, до якої відноситься і американська, канадська, єврейська і австралійська ідентичності, східноєвропейська, Східна Європа і країни колишнього Совєтського Союзу, і ізраїльська. І тільки в 91-му році у нас з'явилася можливість навчати своїх дітей. Ми почали відкривати школи, ми почали займатися вихованням, ми почали повертати традицію, відбудовувати синагоги, і це все робилося вже в незалежній Україні. Я не можу сказати, що держава нам дуже допомагала, але вона не заважала. Все, на що нам вистачало своєї енергії, я приймав участь ще з 80-х років, як тільки звільнився в відновленні єврейського життя. Ми зробили все, на що нас вистачало енергії, грошей і професіоналізму. І нам ніхто не заважає це робити досі. Але для мене поворотними точками є Майдани. Чому? Насправді вони не є поворотними. Справа в тому, що ідентичність змінюється еволюційно, поступово. Блаженніший Любомир Гузар, кардинал греко-католицький, сказав: дайте людям вирости у свободі. З 91-го року і українці, і меншини, і, зокрема, євреї в Україні живуть в свободі. І вони формують самі своє життя. І це дуже важливий чинник. І саме це повернуло. Ті накопичення цих нових рис ідентичності дало те, що євреї прийняли участь у Майдані 2004 року, але небагато їх було. У 2013 році вже було їх більше. Таким чином, в мене народилася формула певна, що совєтські євреї, євреї України у проміжний етап 90-ті роки, і українські євреї, яких тепер стає все більше і більше. Їх питома вага з часом збільшується, українських євреїв. І це і є модернізація цієї політичної нації. Що їх об'єднує з українцями? Вони разом будують державу, разом будують політичну націю. І ця спільна робота і є тим, що їх пов'язує. Але одночасно в суспільстві є і совєтські євреї, і євреї України, які ще не визначилися, і українські євреї. І в мене я більш близький до українських, кримських татар, які разом з нами відбудовують Україну, демократію, свободу, ніж з тими євреями, які залишилися совєтські. Хоч ми з ними одні по етнічних ознаках і навіть по релігійних. Ось така дивна трансформація єврейської ідентичності у Україні. Дякую.
Mark, I wanted to say something that Otik touched on there before we get back into inside Ukraine is the question of diaspora through that charming anecdote about Australian Jews. But why are there no Ukrainian Jews in the diaspora? I mean, Russian Jews, yes. What is, or even Soviet Jews? I have relatives in Brighton Beach, and it's, there's a clear conception of Soviet Jews there.
Well, it's exactly what Professor Hrytsak was talking about. It's only recently that the idea of Ukrainian polity actually became concrete in the world, so that there is a state to which people can owe allegiance. Prior to the establishment of a real Ukrainian state, because the Ukrainian SSSR is not really a state, it's a figment on paper. There was no polity. There were Ukrainians in the sense of people who professed an ethnic Ukrainian nationality, but prior to the 20th century they often called themselves Ruthines or Rusines rather than Ukrainians, and there was no way that Jewish people would identify themselves as belonging to that nationality. And as they emigrated to a diaspora, they would certainly not identify themselves with that ethnic group. So there was no real way to establish that sort of national identity. And if people did remember their homeland, in terms of Ukrainians, as you mentioned in your introduction, it would be to remember the pogroms or at least to remember a story about the pogroms. And in terms of remembering who they are, I always say if you go to North America, and I'm sure it's the case in Britain as well, and you ask Jewish people where their family comes from, the answer will be Poland or Russia. And the reality is that over half of the people whom you ask that question really have ancestors who come from the territory of modern-day Ukraine. They either come from Galicia or they come from the Pale of Settlement. Galicia was assimilated into Poland, and the Pale of Settlement was ruled by Russia until after the Second World War. So that's where the imagination of the diaspora still exists. And of course, our history is quite unique because for linguistic reasons, we're still back 500 years ago with the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania. So people are either Galiciana or they're Litvaks.
So hold on. You're telling me JFS, JW3, New London Synagogue, all these institutions where people think they're Russian or Polish Jews, and they're actually Ukrainian Jews.
Most of
Most of North London are Ukrainian Jews.
If you're looking at
I'm not talking about St. John's Wood, that's different.
Yeah, that's
different.
they're Ukrainian Jews if you're going to look at a modern day map. But of course, somebody, say, who was born in Munkac would tell you that's ridiculous, don't look at a modern day map, because somebody who had been born in Munkac at the turn of the century could, within his lifetime, be a citizen of Austria-Hungary, of, I guess, Russia, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, the Slovak Republic, Hungary, who knows? You would know better, but at least 5 or 6 different countries. The map keeps moving, and people have to keep up with it. And the Jews have to learn each language in succession in order to keep up with it.
Yaroslav, coming back to the present day, is Ukraine an anti-Semitic country? In the sense that, what does the polling tell us? And how can we even try measuring this? Because it's certainly something that creeps up in the media quite a lot.
I think how to answer this question. To be, in a sense, yes. In a sense that every country is anti-Semitic. In this sense, yes. And most unfortunately, anti-Semitism is a global phenomenon. And whatever country you pick up, so there is some kind of anti-Semitism. The real question is to what extent the country is anti-Semitic. So what I would answer the sense that Ukraine is increasingly less and less and less and less anti-Semitic. There are some objective measures like a Bogardus scale, if you know what I mean. There's the scale that social scientists use that measures the distance to different ethnic groups, various ethnic groups, and also some groups like homosexuals, because they're even much more alienated than the other group. So let me put this way, that on this scale, Jews has the same positions like Poles and Canadians, which means neither positive nor negative, rather positive than negative. The most negative groups are Arabs, as strange as it sounds.
Are there any Arabs in Ukraine?
It's exactly Arabs, because Arabs is mixed with Muslims. And since Muslims very much taken as a point of the terrorism, put it differently, let me finish this way. So the most hated group or alienated group are Romas, Arabs, and homosexuals. And the most closest group are the Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians and Belarusians. That's it. So the Jews are sometime in the middle. If also has some kind of comparison with other countries, surprising as it is, as it sounds, as it looks, Ukraine has a very positive tendency in a sense that Ukraine feel much closer to Jews than, say, Poland than Russia and other country. You could Google Pew. This is the famous international sociological firm who did this study recently, which shows that actually Ukraine anti-Semitism presents Ukrainians in a very much attractive light. It doesn't mean to say there's no anti-Semitism in Ukraine. There is anti-Semitism in Ukraine, but then you locate who is this anti-Semites and what kind of rhetoric they use and for what purposes they use. so to say. But basically, I say so, if I may end somewhere, if Ukraine would be better off country, if Ukraine would have a better standards of life, more stability, and there is no war, I believe that many Jews would consider this country as a potential place to live, because they're much more secure and much more comfortable than living in other countries. So this probably will be the shortest answer to this question.
Osik, I think for the first time, or in recent memory, we see the entry of Jewish political figures very actively into the politics of the country. The Prime Minister is Jewish. How is that treated inside the political discourse by journalists, by the political establishment? Are they treated as Jewish politicians, or how is this framed?
Якщо торкатися Володимира Гройсмана, то його більше сприймають не як політика, а як менеджера, як адміністратора, бо він прем'єр-міністр. Він не в парламенті, він не є президентом. Але я хочу про інше. Єдине, можливо, з небагатьох питань, де я відчуваю себе майже професіоналом, це якраз питання моніторингу і аналізу антисемітизму. Бо я займаюся цим 30 років, будую різні мережі ще з часів Совєтського Союзу, які досліджують це явище на тій території. І я знаю також ситуацію у світі, я навіть знаю ситуацію в Великій Британії. Я не знаю, чи багато серед вас є, серед присутніх тих, хто знає, скільки антисемітських інцидентів на рік відбувається в Британії. Хтось знає це? Я знаю. 600 інцидентів. Порядок 600. Так ось, Ярослав прав, що антисемітизм є усюди. Питання в тому, який він. Наприклад, після 91-го року, я вже казав, в Україні відсутній державний антисемітизм. Нема жодного елементу державної політики, яка би прямо була спрямована проти євреїв. Те визначення, яке в Європі сприйняли під антисемітизмом, обов'язково передбачає присутність або в інциденті, в висловах, обов'язково ненависті до євреїв. Так ось, треба розподіляти це і розуміти, що є міжнародна класифікація. Вона фіксує певні прояви, є європейські інституції, яким цим займаються, і в Західній Європі найбільше це Німеччина. Там на рік відбувається близько 2000 антисемітських інцидентів. Що називається антисемітським інцидентом? Це або напад, фізичний напад на ґрунті антисемітизму, ненависті, або акт вандалізму проти єврейської власності, або надписи на стінах графіті, свастики і таке інше. На єврейських об'єктах, можливо, на приватних або на общинах, на синагогах і таке інше. Так ось, це є інциденти. Є ще, крім hate crimes, є ще hate speech, вислови. Вони фіксуються окремо. І дуже непрофесійно, коли це звалюється все в одну купу і рахується разом. Треба розподіляти і порівнювати окремі складові. Так ось, в Україні за останні роки, а ми їх фіксуємо, ці параметри, дуже ретельно, у нас працює один з найкращих в Східній Європі фахівців по моніторингу і аналізу проявів антисемітизму, його звуть В'ячеслав Ліхачов. Кожен рік він видає репорт, ось за 17-й рік, і вже готовий за 18-й рік. І ми знаємо, скільки інцидентів в Україні, скільки випадків вандалізму антисемітського в Україні. І вони, повірте, набагато менше, ніж в Західній Європі. Навіть менше, ніж в Чехії. Бо в Чехії їх близько 200 за рік. В Україні ось в останньому році, в 18-му, як і в 17-му, не було жодного нападу на ґрунті антисемітизму. Жодного фізичного нападу. З усією відповідальністю я вам про це говорю. Жодний експерт в світі, ані з Канади, ані з Америки, не може додати до нашого моніторингу жодного інцидента. Це дуже професійно, відповідальний і чесний моніторинг. Ми не хочемо применшати, ми не хочемо перебільшувати прояви антисемітизму в Україні. Що стосується вандалізму, у нас в минулому році було 12 випадків антисемітського вандалізму. Таким чином, загалом це все одно 12, бо не було нападів. 12 із 600. 12 і 800 у Франції, 12 і 2000 в Німеччині, 12 і 200 в Чехії. Ось картина антисемітизму в Україні. Він є, але він дуже низького рівня. І справа тут, можливо, не зовсім і в Україні. Справа в континентальних різних чинниках. Справа в тому, що антисемітизм в Східній Європі суттєво відрізняється від антисемітизму в Західній Європі. В Західній Європі присутні два потужних чинника, які визначають антисемітизм тут. Перше – це радикальне крило ісламської діаспори, яка робить основні напади, основні графіті, основні випадки вандалізму. Але друге – це цікавіше, другий чинник. Це дуже модно в колах лівої інтелігенції, ліберальної, гіпертрофія порушень прав людини. З цього виростає антиізраїльська налаштованість цих лівих кругов, ви знаєте, як ліві навіть в Британії ліберисти зараз налаштовані проти Ізраїлю. І через таку витіснення, через таку сублімацію антиізраїльська переходить в антисемітську. Ми, євреї, сприймемо однаково. Для нас антиізраїльська позиція – це антисемітська. І тут у нас двох думок нема навколо цього. Цих двох чинників потужних, ані ліберального гіпертрофірованого відношення, ані ісламського радикального екстремізму нема. В Східній Європі їх нема. Тому я єдине, в чому не погоджуюсь з паном Ярославом, що якщо стане рівень життя вищий в Україні, наша країна стане приваблива для мігрантів, особливо з Арабського Сходу. І з'явиться ісламський чинник, який також може дати нам збільшення антисемітських випадків. Що стосується українського вкладу, він мінімальний. І я вірю, що так буде і далі.
So, I've been tapped on my shoulder by various people. Very briefly on the subject, so I do want to sort of move on because our time is limited and we have to cover 1,000 years of history and at least 5 or 6 issues on the political spectrum. But, Mark.
Yeah. Just briefly, first of all, I'm obviously here under false pretenses. The closest I ever got to serving time in prison was in 1967 when I naively drove a rented car across East Germany trying to cross into West Berlin in a rented car with "We Stand by Israel" plastered across the windows and was invited to step into a room plastered with pictures of the Leipzig Trade Fair of 1953 and thought I was about to be shocked. Although I did for a time teach at a university and I do by accident hold a PhD, it was in English literature, which will not help me tonight. But I was for a time, again by accident and by a mistake, appointed Deputy Attorney General for the province of Ontario, so I know a little bit about hate literature and about the prosecution of hate literature. So I'd like to think about the concept of anti-Semitism slightly differently. It seems to me that we've been talking about the idea of a new Ukraine and the opening up of Ukrainian nationhood and a feeling of belonging in a way that unfortunately resembles the Whig view of history, the inevitable triumph of liberalism. And Jews traditionally have been attracted to a liberal opening and the idea of a pluralistic state, a meritocracy, where everyone is accepted on the basis of their talents and not on the basis of who they are. That's one view, and that's our view of the new Ukraine, why UJE is in existence, to bring about a dialogue between Ukrainians and Jews based on a realistic view of their history and a view of a new Ukraine. That's one view. There's another view that is based on the very ethnic definitions that in the past, as Professor Hrytsak said, excluded Jews from the definition of Ukraine. just as it excluded Jews from the definition of who's a Czech, the definition of who's a Hungarian, the definition of who's a Bulgarian, all through that region. I'm not confident that the final struggle over what it means to be a Ukrainian has taken place yet. It's certainly all over the world that struggle is still taking place. And to me, anti-Semitism in Ukraine is associated with an atavistic nationalism, with the right-wing form of anti-Semitism, not the left-wing form that Mr. Zissels has rightly talked about, which is not present in Ukraine, but it is very much rooted in the Second World War and in the run-up to the Second World War, which nobody on the panel has talked about. But Ukrainian anti-Semitism in its most virulent form, which I think still exists in some places, and we have to talk about it realistically, is based on a warped anti-communism that identifies Jews with Judeo-Bolshevism and says that communism is Jewish. And that has not disappeared yet, and that's one of the areas where one has to confront the anti-Semitism, and one has to continue the struggle.
We're actually going to get into that for the meat of our discussion, but you raised an important point here, which is about Ukraine, and to what extent it's imagining its future as a political Ukrainian community or as an ethnic one. I mean, in my understanding, I've met, personally after the Maidan or during the Maidan, I met people who advertised the idea of an ethnic Ukrainian state. They actually believed, they were from the right sector, and they believed that there was a Ukrainian chromosome that had developed there from Paleolithic times because the people who lived there had fought mammoths, and they had a special heroic spirit which had been passed on. Their best friends were Russian Nazis who also believed in a Russian chromosome. They wanted to bring together all the different fascist movements, la, 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 la. During the Maidan, we were incredibly alarmed by these people. They then got under 1% in the elections. They had one glamorous guy who became a deputy. And I mean, but how strong is this idea of an ethnic Ukrainian future in Ukrainian politics? Is it something we should be scared of, or are we actually we ended up writing so many articles about these people in the Western Jewish press that we kind of like started getting scared of them, and then the election happened, and we're like, oh my God, we've been writing about freaks. Yeah.
You look in my direction. So
no, I look looking at freaks, sorry.
There is a danger, without a doubt. This is danger which is constant there. There's no denying. And what the question addressed to Iosif, and I want to also to add to this question, there is recently a new theme, a new topic, whatever you say, in Ukrainian public discourse, that Ukraine is ruled by Jews. They even call it worse, Jewish yoke over Ukraine. And this is directly related to Poroshenko, the president, Groisman, the prime minister, several ministers who are Jewish origins, or they presume to be of Jewish origin, and also including Yulia Tymoshenko, who also believed to be a Jew. Typical Jew of Armenian origin. So the story goes, and which is went around by the Ukrainian nationalists of this milieu which Peter was referring, that actually Ukraine is never ruled by the Jews, and this is kind of Semitic plot, made by Soros, all the kind of things. So there's the new topics there. And the irony is that all the main candidates for next presidential elections, we have this in March, they're all either Jews or presumed to be Jews. So this gives you an idea about the new reality in Ukraine, the importance of the Jewish issue, Jewish identity, and emerges this identity. So this is kind of the story which is probably not quite serious, but even so it's not quite serious, should be taken very, very seriously. But also very important, another part of the story, that this is exactly one of the rhetorics that was used intentionally and very kind of persistently by the leaders of the separatist Donbass. Because they believe they fight not against Ukraine, they fight against Judo-Masons. by the Mason Ryan, by Soros, by Rothschild, or the kind of things. And they exactly used the example of the Poroshenko as a supposedly Waltzman, Groisman, the kind of thing. So this is another. What I'm saying, what exactly this line, which was proposed by Peter. Even so, they hate each other. In many sense, Ukrainian nationalists, they're very similar because they have the similar line of arguments because they believe that Ukraine are ruled by Jews. That said, so exactly this is, I would refer here to the point of the Likhachov, which I believe is perfect expert, and this is what Iosif was referring to. He made this very important point, that even so we have this kind of the event phenomenon in Ukraine, we have it everywhere in this region, without a doubt. Wonder if it won't be such a phenomenon in this country, given the history and the political circumstances. There is one crucial difference between Ukrainian nationalists, Russian nationalists, Polish nationalists, Hungarian nationalists, like that. They never get more than 1% of the voting. And this, I believe, is a crucial difference. If this could be not neglected, no, it's not going to be neglected because they could always get more percentages. But this is the real state is nowadays that they have this kind of very marginal position. They most likely, not most likely, it's definitely, they wouldn't have no chance on presidential elections. No one in this election will be there. They got even more than 10%, I believe, less than that. They probably have some chance of the parliamentary election. Let's wait and see. But even so, I would get this, the chances as not. So basically, this is, I would say this, if I may conclude somewhere, we had a lot of verbal anti-Semitism, verbal violence, but not kind of physical violence or political violence. And I believe the still trend is rather stable, and the trend is still less and less ethnic, more and more civic nation.
I want to move on because, you know, this is a potential problem, but overall, the movement, if we look at it in the historical context, is clearly positive. But where it does get interesting, and what is a mainstream debate, is how a new country like Ukraine still tries to make sense of its history. And its history is deeply fractured in the sense that I don't want to drag people into sort of like the more sort of complex and occult bits of this debate. It's a very, you know, it's a very virulent debate in Ukraine and among people who are experts of Ukraine. But I'm oversimplifying here. One person Ukrainian freedom fighter during the Second World War is another person's anti-Semite who wants to clear Ukraine from Jews, or who wants an ethnically pure Ukraine. I mean, I think we have very similar problems in our history here. Certainly in all our history and how we think about Northern Ireland, we have this problem all the time. Are Sinn Féin heroes, or are they just terrorists? And virtually all national liberation movements, I think anywhere in the world, have this paradox. In Britain, of course, we have the much deeper paradox that we've never dealt with, is how do we deal with our colonial history? How do we teach history in a classroom where there are Indian kids and English kids who oppress the Indian kids' grandparents? And largely we just don't talk about it. So how is Ukraine dealing with this? Because there is a wave of statues going up, and so sometimes I see posts going, oh my God, you know, a statue has gone up to someone who was genuinely a Ukrainian freedom fighter, but you then look at their statements about Jews and they're pretty appalling. So how do we even approach this? And I think we should embrace the issue in its complexity, because I think it's one it doesn't help to whitewash either way. I mean, Yaroslav, even on the level of tuition in schools and what's taught at universities and in schools, and in terms of national memory, how is this playing out, and what could be the way forward?
Ukrainian situation is hardly unique. You could hardly find a country which is not divided on many issues of its own history. Ukraine is probably more divided than other country, but still there are some points which are united the country, and therefore the historical narratives is built around this kind of figure that could unite the country, so to say. And definitely there is kind of historical figures that comes from the pre-20th century, like Kievan kings, Khmelnytsky, by the way, the national poets, Shevchenko, which is very much like a Russian Pushkin and Polish Mickiewicz, and historical sporty figures, rock figures, all the kind of things, they are there. And therefore you could build some kind of narrative 1992. But there is one thing I believe is very important here. Once you bring the issue of this national fighter, you immediately got dividing effect. If you want to see Ukrainians divided, start talking about Bandera.
Do we know who Bandera is for the non-Ukrainian experts? Bandera was one of the leaders of the Ukrainian national movement, first against the Nazis, then against the Soviets. By 1941, he was in a German concentration camp.
Yeah.
But interestingly, he then became a figure of kind of either adoration by some Ukrainian nationalists, a sort of a bogeyman in Soviet propaganda, and now increasingly one of these very divisive nationalists.
There is hardly a Ukrainian figure that had such international fame recently than Bandera. Because this figure, which is discussed in Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Germany, Israel, and Northern America.
He also killed a lot of Poles.
Yeah, but it was without a doubt. He didn't kill it himself because it was concentration camps, but the movement, which bear his name, Banderivtsi, they did a kind of very much atrocities, which could be probably inside a genocide against the Poles. So he was many of the records. So the point is, if you want to see Ukrainian divided, start talking about Bandera. Quite of a sudden have two different types, attitudes which could be hardly reconciled. And this is true, and this is the problem which we're dealing with. But if you want to see Ukrainians united, start talking about Stalin. Quite of a sudden, Stalin unites Ukraine as an anti-hero. And has an explanation, because nowadays more and more the symbol of the famine, of the Holodomor, becomes increasingly important. And since many Ukrainian families has this memory as a personal memory, which is forbidden in the Soviet Union, now this historical memory, which officially resonates with the personal stories, and if Russians see Stalin as a nation builder, as one who rose the Russia from the benign state to the world power, who fought against Nazis, all the kind of things, there is nothing such of these meanings in Ukrainian case, because in Ukrainian case, Stalin is always in the fight with the famine and with the repression. So I'm saying here, without a doubt, there is dividing things, but there is something which is united there. How could it be reconciled? What I'm trying to say here, it's an important point. Ukraine has many problems. They have problems with reconciliation with Jews. They have problems with reconciliation with Poles. But believe me, they have much more problems with reconciliation between themselves. The major problem is Ukrainian reconciliation, especially nowadays, since the Ukraine has been a civic nation. So my answer would be, there were several, since Ukrainian situation is not unique, there were several recipes how to reconcile this kind of the narratives. I wouldn't go that far because there's a lot of literature about the things, please. But first of all, you should say history clearly and describe the fact clearly, and says, yes, Bandera was a hero, but he's responsible for many atrocities, the kind of things. So this is basically the most responsible answer to this question. Yeah. So this is basically, and this is what liberal historian says, basically, the message here. We should accept Bandera. We could not neglect Bandera, because let's face it, he was a hero, in a sense that many heroes is very close to the bandits, because the difference is very slim, so to say. We know the story. But let's face it, he was a hero, but he was responsible. And this must be clearly said. But also the other story is, if you want to have this kind of the reconciliation, don't talk big stories. Don't talk ideologies. Talk simple stories. Stories that people from below, the complicated stories, how to manage to survive, how they betray each other, how they help each other. Because this is the most important point of reconciliation. It's not unique again. It has been did everything. And what helps Ukraine nowadays since? Because Ukraine nowadays in the war. And people know the complicated story. And since they know their own complicated story, they could resonate with the story of the past. The nothing was that much simple. And this, I believe, one of the, I'm not saying Ukrainians are doing that only. There's one thing about the importance of Ukraine, it's very good of Ukraine. There is no single narrative. There's no dominant narrative. It's a beauty of the country. There's no monopoly. There are several narratives. Some of them competitive with each other, some of them could be consistent with each other. So actually, teachers could pick up whatever he or she wants. And basically what I'm saying here, that there are some attempts to write good historical books along these lines. But they will be successful, I don't know, but at least we have to give them a try and credit of the society that this might work.
Iosif, you work with this very closely, both in your communication with other minorities and with, the Ukrainian authorities. How do you see this coming together? Do you think Ukraine will be able to have these sort of competing narratives at the same time?
Про реальний антисемітизм я вже розповідав. Але крім реального, є міфічний. Є багато міфів і легенд, які сьогодні передусім об'єднуються російською пропагандою. І крім того, що сказав пан Ярослав про одне з розгалуджень тої пропаганди російської, що владу в Україні захопили євреї, що це масонський заколот, і це загорожує. Але ця пропаганда спрямована на молоду генерацію. Але є і інше розгалудження, більш потужне, що в Україні до влади прийшли фашисти. Ультранаціоналісти, вони погрожують всьому, і демократії, і євреям, і всім іншим національним меншинам. І треба розділяти міфи від реальності. Героїзація колабораціоністів або героїзація катів – це один з міфів, який майже не має під собою ніякої реальності. Для мене тут взагалі, як для українського єврея, дуже просто. Істота, яка зі зброєю в руках грабує, гвалтує, вбиває, це є злочинець. І нема терміну давнини. Навіть через 80 років такого треба судити, бо він застосовував зброю проти мирного населення. В той же час людина, яка зі зброєю в руках захищає свою родину, свій дім, своє село, свою державу від іноземних окупантів, це є захисник і, скоріше, герой. І це треба розділяти. Я кажу так, що ані Бендера, ані Шухевич не є моїми власними героями, бо я єврей, і в мене є родова пам'ять. Але я розумію, чому для половини українців вони герої. Вони загинули за незалежність України. І цього вже достатньо. Я не думаю, що є люди в Україні, половини, які прославляють цих героїв за те, що вони нібито вбивали євреїв. Чи погано до них. Взагалі про це ніхто не думає. Вони загинули за Україну, і цього достатньо. І не герої поєднують, я згоден з паном Ярославом, нас поєднує з українцями і з іншими наше спільне майбутнє, де є демократія, де є незалежність від Російської нової імперії, де нема антисемітизму, нема ксенофобії і є стійкий економічний розвиток. Це нас об'єднує з усіма і меншинами, і з більшістю українців, хоча Україна розділена і не по національній ознаці, а скоріше між Заходом і Сходом, між Євразією і Європою. І те, що зараз коїться на Донбасі, де воюють представники різних етнічних груп, і росіяни воюють з української сторони, і євреї воюють з української сторони. Так само, як на Майдані. Першим загинув вірменин, потім білорус, і серед сотні небесної були 3 людини з єврейського походження. Ось що об'єднує спільне майбутнє України. А ті, хто проросійські, вони є в кожній етнічній групі. І в українській, і в єврейській, і в будь-якій іншій. Але це наше минуле. Оця Небесна Сотня розділила історію України на незворотній минуле від майбутнього, авторитарне від демократичного. І я сподіваюся, що це все позаду. Бо я знаю про 2,5 тисячі українців, які рятували євреїв під час Холокосту. І я хочу в Україні, де живуть нащадки цих людей, а не нащадки тих негідників, які допомагали видавати і вбивати євреїв.
So I'm quite keen to get into questions because we have until 9 o'clock. Is that right? Is that my time frame? Do you have something you want to? I don't want to censor. So I mean, are there any questions? If not, I'll ask them. But maybe some people have some. Okay, why don't we take them in bunches? Let's do them in. Don't be scared. Okay, let's move from the back down. There's the one right at the back, and then we'll take sort of 2 or 3 going down.
Microphone.
We'll just wait for the microphone to come to you. And if you can, very briefly, introduce yourself.
My name is Bernard Herman. I have been to Ukraine, but I have no specialist knowledge of the subject or the place. My question is, firstly, how many Jews are living in Ukraine? And secondly, is there a difference in Ukrainian Jewish identity between those living in the west of the country, in the old Habsburg part, and those living in the east of the country, who usually look towards Russia?
I'm just a little intrigued by the change of title. And it's certainly relevant to Ukrainian sensitivities, although not specifically to Jewish ones. Jews and the new Ukraine becomes Jews and new Ukraine. Now, I do understand the sensitivity over the definite article in terms of the phrase the Ukraine, because of its association with the word Kurai, which suggests that Ukraine is a territory on the edge of Russia. However, to say the new Ukraine is absolutely not the same as saying the Ukraine. For example, you could say Jews and the new Germany, which is not to suggest that there's a territory called the Germany. That's all.
Okay. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Mike Crabb. I'm twofold question. I'm firstly a member of the Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue, and we have actually twinned with the Tevar congregation in Lviv, and we went there back in June, and there's gradually a progressive congregation arising there. And secondly, I do have a family connection with that place, because my father-in-law, who's still very much alive in Suffolk, is 93, and at the time was a guest of Stalin in Kazakhstan as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But 2 questions I wanted to ask you, and you haven't mentioned it yet, is the stranglehold that Russia has on the Ukraine, particularly in with relationship to energy supplies, when at the moment, you know, they supply so much of the natural gas. They've now confiscated the part around the Donbass, and as a result of that, coal production has been halved. And while I was in Ukraine back in June, having to go to people's houses which are freezing cold in minus 30 degrees centigrade, and I wanted to know what the Ukrainian government is actually doing about energy conservation in that country. Thank you very much.
Take a couple more.
Я українською задам запитання для різноманітності. Пане Зissels і пане Hrytsak, за кого будете голосувати на виборах президента України?
Я не почув.
За кого будете голосувати на виборах президента України?
Okay, well, a Jew, definitely, we know that. Or someone thought to be a Jew. No, we've decided that Tymoshenko is Jewish now, so that's pretty much narrows the field. Take one more, and then we'll do them in a bundle.
Hello, my name is Katarina Tirsen. I'm a member of the Communist League. That's why I went to Maidan and actually visited there. And I agree, the right sector might be visible, but the number of people that we talked to over there, there were certainly a broad sector of the working class or the working people who did Maidan. And I think it's very encouraging that you refer that to a turning point, because I think that is how history is made, in massive popular mobilizations. That's how you build unity. And I think that is very, very important. And, you know, I also think it's very important to keep an eye what is happening to anti-Semitism in the world, including in Ukraine, which is another reason why we went there. And I think it's important to point out this liberal anti-Semitism that is growing very much in this country. And my question is, first I want to say, the future is mobilization of the working class. That's my opinion, which you might have guessed. But this ideological anti-Semitism, that's my question, isn't that a danger? And how could that develop if, for some, because of what's happening in the world, you will have more immigration into Ukraine? Don't we need to really deal with that as well, as some of you have pointed out? Thank you.
Okay, so let's start tackling those. How many Jews are there in Ukraine, actually? That's a question for Osik, I think. And are the Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Jews? Are they different to the rest, I guess? I mean, I'm not sure where the Austro-Hungarian Jews end, really.
А хто запитав це? Скільки євреїв? А скажіть, скільки євреїв в Великій Британії? Я вам скажу, скільки в Україні. Неправильно. Дивіться, є як найменше 3 визначення, за якими демографи рахують євреїв. Перше – це перепис населення. Якщо б сьогодні відбувся в Україні перепис населення, то приблизно 70 тисяч громадян України назвали б себе євреями. Друге визначення – це релігійне, галахічне. У кого мати єврейка, або хто прийняв юдаїзм як релігію. Якщо порахувати, то таких буде 150 тисяч. Є закон про повернення ізраїльський, відповідно до якого людина може потрапити і отримати громадянство Ізраїлю. Таких людей сьогодні в Україні 350 тисяч. Я не знаю, чи я відповів на ваше питання.
And there was a second part to the question.
Да.
Is the
Чи є різниця в ідентичності?
yeah, is Jewish identity different in the West and the East?
Да. Я спробував говорити, коли говорив про ідентичність, що ідентичність меншини національної дуже залежить від ідентичності оточуючого соціуму. Певною мірою меншина слідує за розвитком ідентичності великого соціуму. І оскільки у нас на Західній Україні і українці трохи інші, ніж на Східній, то, відповідно, і євреї також відрізняються. Євреї Західної України, вони, можна сказати, якщо спростити, вони більше українські євреї, ніж східні. І я вже одразу стосовно неправильної назви української євреї. Це прийнята назва. Є британські євреї, є французькі євреї, є німецькі євреї, угорські, румунські, і є зараз українські євреї. Це результат розвитку ідентичності за останні 200 років. І Україна, чим більше вона стає європейською країною, хоч до цього ще далеко, тим більше в ній буде саме українських євреїв.
And also, while we have you, who's going to win the presidential elections?
Ну, я не політолог, але для мене не це важливо. Для мене важливо, що хто б не прийшов в президенти України, ну, з першої п'ятірки кандидатів, я впевнених, це моє суб'єктивне переконання, ніхто вже не поверне Україну назад до Російської імперії нової. Навіть якщо це буде більше проросійський кандидат, над кожним з президентів буде висіти кошмар Майдану. Бо двічі за останні 15 років спроби повернути Україну на схід стикалися з новою українською ідентичністю, яка виводила мільйони людей на Майдани. І така пасіонарність може знести будь-кого. Якщо вона знесла Януковича, то тим більше вона знесе будь-кого, хто буде намагатися повернути нас у минуле, в авторитарну систему і в Російську імперію.
Mark, this question of a new ideological anti-Semitism emerging. You mentioned the idea of sort of an ethnic nationalist one, which would obviously have a potential very strong anti-Semitic turn. But what are the other ways that anti-Semitism could return into the mainstream of political discourse?
Well, I don't think liberal anti-Semitism has a chance in Ukraine by any means. So it will be the atavistic anti-Semitism that Russian propaganda will tell you has already taken place and is already there.
What about kind of anti-capitalist populism?
Yeah,
Let's say there's more problems, the economy crashes much worse, the elites are all Jews, the bank. I mean, that kind of stereotype one.
I think that is a grave danger, but I think it's the same danger that we face throughout Europe and throughout North America. We're seeing it. We all assume, naively, I think, that, as Francis Fukuyama said, we've come to the end of history. The world has unfolded the way it should, and we've come to liberal democracy as the final stage in the evolution of our politics, and we'll live happily ever after. But the 21st century is showing us that that's not necessarily the case, and we have to fight for liberal democracy if we believe in it. We are very much in a situation in most Western democracies where these sorts of forces are there to be exploited by unscrupulous politicians who should know better but don't. And I think that, yes, from what I've seen, and again, I'm here under false pretenses. I'm no expert in any of these areas, but anecdotally and from what I experience, there's a lot of this going around, and I hear all the same things that Professor Hrytsak talks about. I hear about the Jewish yoke. People in the areas that I go to assume I don't understand any Ukrainian, so they feel free to say whatever's on their mind to my face, which is kind of a privilege that I have. So I hear a lot of things. And again, I do not believe Ukraine is anti-Semitic. I do not believe Ukrainians are anti-Semitic, but I do believe that there is a subterranean anti-Semitism in a lot of places, and I do believe that it's rife for exploitation and that there are people who are willing to exploit it.
Iosif, sorry, you wanted to say something?
Так, ми дуже ретельно і уважно слідкуємо за всіми праворадикальними групами в Україні. Всі вони без виключення маргінальні групи. Жодна з них не представлена в парламенті, на відміну від Західної Європи, де багато праворадикальних партій є в парламентах. Я вважаю, що наше громадянське суспільство більшою мірою, меншою держава контролюють ситуацію з активністю праворадикальних груп. Я вам можу назвати їх назви, але я впевнений, що ви майже нікого з них не чули взагалі. Це тільки фахівці в них розбираються. На виборах 2014 року президентську було два праворадикальних кандидата. Олег Тягнебок від партії «Свобода» і Дмитро Ярош від того правого сектора, який згадувався. Вони разом набрали менше 2%. 2%. А один єврейський кандидат Рабінович набрав більше, ніж вони обидва – 2,25%. Про що ми говоримо? Є праві радикали, але вони дуже мізерні за впливом. Це не мейнстрим українського життя, праві радикали. Коли мене лякають правими радикалами, я скажу, я їх не боюся, а я боюся популістів. Кожний третій громадянин України відповідно до досліджень соціологічних, здатен проголосувати за популістів. І це більша загроза для України, ніж праві радикали. Тим більше, що праві радикали, можливо, тимчасово, але зосереджені зараз домінантно на одному ворогові, на Росії. І навіть ліві політологи, такі як Андреас Умланд, німецький політолог, вважає, що це виправдано, бо Росія веде агресивну війну проти України. Всі праві радикали, які ми знаємо, не ведуть антисемітської пропаганди. Можливо, тимчасово. Вони здатні, можливо, як в Західній Європі, також навантажувати свою ідеологію. Але я б не став надавати велике значення ідеології, особливо в нашій частині світу, в Україні, де політичне життя не ідеологічне. Це просто боротьба груп інтересів, корпоративних інтересів.
Look, there's also a question about energy, which I don't think any of us is actually qualified to answer, but if somebody wants to, I'd be happy to. I'm just sorry, I don't think it's the right... I mean, it's a super important question, and I know there's a lot of drives to, change energy consumption in Ukraine. I just don't know anything about it. I'm not sure anyone here does. Should we take some more questions, just more trying to stick to this, Ukrainian Jewish theme that we're dedicated to this evening? This time we'll go from the bottom up. What's easier for you? Is it easier for you bottom down? You don't mind? Sorry, I'm making you run around. Yeah? We only have 7 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for wonderful discussion. I'm myself from Kiev, and I'm both of Jewish and Ukrainian background, so this is very interesting for me. As you have mentioned correctly, Ukraine was home to the most number of Jews some time ago, and obviously the scale of Holocaust on Ukrainian territory was huge. So is there now, I know there are a lot of grassroots projects to commemorate this and to actually bring awareness of this, but is there any support from the state to educate people and to actually make this topic important and remembered in Ukraine?
Okay, that's very important. Couple more? Oh, look, there's a whole row here. We don't have much time, so we're going to be fairly brutal with these, but...
Very brief question to Professor Hrytsak, because he mentioned the problem with Bandera and heroization of Bandera. And obviously it's a contradiction of New Ukraine and New Ukrainian philo-Semitism and the governmental policy of building new historical narrative. I'm talking about the National Institute of Historical Memory, which is dominated just by Bandera, UPA, and fully disregarding other parts of the Ukrainian history as, let's say, the whole period of Ukrainian People's Republic. How to put together these two things? New approach to Jewry, heroization of Bandera, state support of such heroization, the whole process which really reminding the experience of Croatia during the days of President Franja Tudjman and heroization of Ustasha as a part of the nation building.
I could have thought of some other examples, but apart from Croatia, but okay. Yeah.
I know Ukraine quite well. I've been working there for many, many years. I find the current developments encouraging, but I find, on the other hand, that speaking about the extent of anti-Semitism, only counting the percentages of how many votes anti-Semitic or radical right candidates got is a bit too narrow. There is something like a hidden anti-Semitism which is very, very spread in the country, and which is part of the, sorry to say, part of the culture even. There is no taboo when it comes, for example, using anti-Semitic stereotypes. They are everywhere, and you can hear them everywhere. there is a lot of things going on in such discourses in the country. So I wonder, and the other thing is there's very little knowledge about Jews in Ukraine, and I find the biggest danger is actually ignorance and a lack of empathy. A lack of empathy concerning the suffering of Jews in one's own country. If one is not open, including collaboration of one's own nation in the Holocaust, if that is not taught in schools, then you will never get really an understanding, and you will never understand, you will never feel this empathy for a nation which has been living in your own territory. So I think education is the crucial thing which is needed now in Ukraine, a new way of speaking about these things and being open about them.
Okay. We really don't have much time, so, okay, I can unite those three questions into one question. Let's see if I can do that with the next three comments. They're all brilliant questions, by the way. I'm just going to have to, it's just a time thing. But I think there's some time afterwards you can come up and torture people and ask them questions. Yeah.
Just to follow up quickly on this gentleman's point, if we allow ourselves to embrace Bandera as a national hero, how can we then deny Russians of their right to accept Stalin as their national hero? And I'm pretty sure Russians would use that for their local propaganda and also elsewhere.
So Stalin defeated Hitler, we don't care about the other stuff. That argument, which you hear most of the time. Yeah, he was terrible, but he saved us from Hitler.
Don't you think that's a bit of having a double standard?
No, I'm just asking. That's the argument you mean. I just wanted to bring that out. Okay, that's a very good question. Yes. Yep.
Final question. What's the future of Jews in Ukraine, good or bad, and the future of the country? So that's it.
Okay. Okay, two more, and then I'm going to have to wrap this. Yes.
Okay, I'll get a chance then. Thank you for your talk. I'm not going to be very long. So I want to refer back to the clear of that talk. I think we have not succeeded in defining the Ukrainian Jewish identity over time. Because the title New Ukraine was referred during the talk first as to the Ukraine of the 20s, and then the Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But we jumped over the whole period of the Soviet Union. As much as you argued that there could have been the Ukrainian Jewish identity during the 20s, and there is such as Mrs. Zissels has argued nowadays in Ukraine, what happened with the Ukrainian Jewish identity during the Soviet period? And I'm thinking now of a case study with the massive immigration of Jews straight after the collapse of the Soviet Union to Germany. I happen to have one of my best friends is the first generation German Jew, and I'm talking about her as a German Jew, even though she wouldn't have ever referred to herself as a German Jew. She would have talked of herself as a Jew, and her family came from Ukraine. I would argue that during the Soviet period, well, we know obviously of cases of suppression, but well, my question is then, what happened to the Ukrainian Jewish identity? Was there a case of Ukrainian Jewish identity during the Soviet period, or was it just Soviet Jewish identity or pure Jewish identity?
Mm-hmm. I wish we could do just a whole session on that. That's such a rich thing. But I'm going to give a quick answer. You were a Soviet Jew. That was the thing. Or you were Soviet Ukrainian. And they were kind of... That's, I think, is the very simple answer. Yep. So in your passport was Soviet Jew or Soviet Ukrainian. Well, they would have... Well, what would they refer to? Jews. I remember that because I lived 9 months in Ukraine. I just think that's such a rich theme. It's going to be hard for us to cover it now. But yes, I think that's absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, this is to ask about Ukraine along this specific experience that I see. I think that given the wars, the crisis, the driving down of living standards, what I find actually, against actually what a lot of people are saying, And I'm not talking about racist incidences or anti-Semitic instances. I'm talking about anti-Semitism in a general sense and racism in a general sense. I think it's a lot lower in many countries in the world today. It's a lot lower, and one of the experiences I pick up on is when there are incidences, it's the disbelief, it's the horror, it's the people coming together, and it's the people responding immediately when it happens, like in the case of the attack on a Jewish community centre when a gunman walked in and killed 11 people in the United States. And then the next day there were school children. That was so immediate.
Sorry, what's the question? I'm sorry, we've run out of time.
My question is, in Ukraine, when you do mention these incidences, do you find people are responding?
That's very interesting. Okay, I got the question. So listen, I'm going to take those, there's so many interesting questions. I'm going to take 3 or 4 of those and put them into one, which is, how is the Holocaust and the question of local collaboration, I mean, Ukraine was occupied for virtually the whole of the Second World War, taught in schools, how is it faced up to? It's not just an issue in Ukraine, it's an issue in all the countries that were caught in the middle during the Second World War, certainly a very big theme in the Baltic states. How is this being tackled, just on the level of basic education?
There is a recent episode. The 2 scholars from Lviv, which is Western Ukraine, which is supposed to be the most nationalist part of the country, wrote a textbook for the kids in the school, in which they clearly stated, implicitly stated that Shukhevich, the one who was quite close to Bandera, was collaborationist, which opened the scandal, mostly from the nationalist part of the now political spectrum, which tried to bring these young scholars, historians, to responsibility in some sense. What happened there, it's just an illustration, that it arose a huge resistance from community of historians, which send letter of support that there is no way for politicians to interfere into history and the teaching of the history and what the historians write, because basically Ukraine is a free country, and so far if they're professionals enough, they are willing to write whatever they will. This is just illustration, so to say.
But what about school textbooks?
School textbook. Since I don't know how many years, but for a long time, Holocaust is the part of the regular schedule in the schools. It has been accepted on the government level and supported by some international documents. There's some consensus about that. So this is the protocols here. This is a part. This is not even discussed, so to say. The other problem is to tackle the responsibility of Ukrainian nationalists. Some of the texts does responsible. Most of them they are not, so to say. But still, there is something which is there. I believe this is your question about Stalin and Bandera. There is a presumption the historical memory in history is the same. It's not the same, because getting a history wrong is a part of being a nation. If history would getting right, there will be no nation, so to say. This is something which means that nation has to have a wrong history. You see what I mean here? And has to have a hero in this sense. So what I'm talking about Bandera is not exactly we're talking about real Bandera. It's the way it presented for the very political purposes, specifically in the country which is waging the war against Russia. Presumably, hypothetically, if Ukraine will be waging a war against Hitler, most likely Stalin will be a hero of Ukraine as well, because this is something which responds, something responsive. So the point is, and this again, about ambivalence, this kind of the how come. Basically, ambivalent is a very natural state of the social consciousness of many Ukrainians. Giving good historical data, many Ukrainians who see Bandera as the hero, simultaneously they see Peter the Great as the hero as well. How come? It's exactly ambivalence. It's an ambivalence, but not Stalin. Stalin and Bandera is mutually exclusive. But Peter the Great and Bandera works together very well, because this is some state of the society which went under the trauma. deep trauma. And if there's a trauma, this is kind of what we know. This is kind of this ambivalence. We could reconcile the thing with which historians could not reconcile. Educate people could not reconcile. But the people on the street, they could easily do. When talking about the anti-Semitism, which Harold raised, without a doubt, there's no denying this fact. And anti-Semitism is very multilateral, multifaceted phenomena. It's better said about the plural, anti-Semitisms, than rather anti-Semitism. This kind of anti-Semitism that Harold described, yeah, it exists very well. But the difference is you could hardly find this anti-Semitism on the level of the public discussions on politicians, so to say. Very rarely. There's really a political leader who dare to produce this kind of anti-Semitic arguments in the political discourse, so to say. So this, I believe, the crucial difference. This is a crucial difference, which says something about Ukraine very, very, very important.
I do want to touch very briefly, we're over the time, but this question of what was the Soviet Ukrainian Jewish experience, was there one? I mean, were there writers who tried to find a way through it? I mean, was it culturally expressed or?
For a very short period, in 20s, only in 20s, there were some examples exactly of the Soviet Ukrainian Jewish, not Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian Jewish identity. There were some writers, like Ivan Kulik. They're not known nowadays. But the 20s, yeah, in the 20s, when the Soviet Ukraine has emerged, and many believe this is not just Soviet Ukraine, but really Ukraine, there are some groups of the Ukrainian Jewish intellectuals who define themselves as Ukraine. But this is a long story. This was much forgotten, and mostly these people has been perished and killed by Stalin in the 30s. So this is now the story has to be rewritten.
Wojciech, a last word.
Якщо можна.
I'll give you 6 years. No, I'll give you 1 minute.
З приводу, якщо хвилину, тоді це буде пунктир. Останні роки є державна підтримка політики пам'ятні, зокрема пам'яті жертв Голокосту. Нема часу розповідати про це, я можу годину говорити. Ви кажете, що це дуже вузько рахувати відсотки. Але ми рахуємо не тільки відсотки, я вам показав, ми рахуємо інциденти антисемітські, ми рахуємо соціологічні дослідження, просто не було часу їх наводити, якщо ви потім підійдете, я вам покажу. Ми рахуємо не тільки скільки було націоналістів, які не пройшли в парламент, у нас євреїв 0,5% населення, а в парламенті їх більше 10%. Або це також не показує вам, що у нас низький рівень антисемітизму. Це як віра, або вона є, або її нема. Я це вивчаю 30 років, я вас запевняю, що сьогодні в Україні набагато менше антисемітизму, ніж було раніше. У нас пік приходив на 2007-2008 роки, у нас нема державного, і у нас набагато менше антисемітизму, ніж в Західній Європі. По колаборації дуже складне питання. Я з Буковини. Буковина була у 40-му році захоплена Совєтським Союзом. Вона ніколи не була російською до цього. Ніколи. Це була анексія. І були українці, були румуни, і були євреї, які співпрацювали з совєтською репресивною владою. Вони були колаборанти? Чи ви рахуєте тільки тих, хто співпрацював з німцями колаборантами? Ось це подвійна бухгалтерія. Якщо рахувати колаборантів, то всіх, і тих, і тих. Або подумати, чи правильно ми їх позначаємо. Чи є майбутнє євреїв України? Якщо вона, як ми очікуємо, стане європейською країною колись, через багато років, то в них є таке майбутнє, яке є у євреїв всієї Європи. Якщо вона, не дай Боже, стане авторитарною країною, то, звичайно, там буде різко зменшуватися кількість через еміграцію. Ви знаєте, що останні роки еміграція з Франції в Ізраїль євреїв більше, ніж з Донбасу, де йде війна. Ось і все. Ідентичність українського єврея – це наша дискусія з паном Ярославом. Я вважаю, що ідентичність такого гатунку, як британський єврей, французький єврей, український єврей, можливо тільки в вільній країні, в незалежній країні і бажано в демократичній країні. Були приклади і раніше, культурні зв'язки були, і я читав поетів, які писали українською мовою, але я кажу, коли я розділяю це совєтські євреї, євреї України і українські євреї, оцю ланцюжок, я маю на увазі євреїв українських після 91-го року. Вони себе ототожнюють з Україною, хоч вони ідентичні євреї, вони розмовляють українською мовою, знають українську літературу, знають українську історію, вони разом з іншими будують майбутню Україну. Оце означає для мене українських євреїв.
Okay, we didn't get into the subject I wanted to, which is the influence of what I think is of Ukrainian folk culture and literature on Hasidic literature. I consider the Hasidic authors Ukrainian authors, writing in the tradition of Gogol and Bulgakov, who I consider Ukrainian authors. But we're not going to do that today. That's going to be a whole different session. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you so much for staying later as well.